WCON 1170 Radio and Star Vision Cable Channel 16 are pleased to present We Should Know, hosted by J.W. Simmons, an upbeat, informative look at people, places, and issues facing our community. This education-based analysis of issues will remain positive and informative as we consider closely what we should know.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. The name of the program is We Should Know. I want to thank Nicole again for those wonderful introductions she does for us each and every week. On Tuesday, 2:30 to 3:30, we're coming to you on Star Vision Channel 16. 2:30 to 3:30 this Tuesday, we're airing Christmas Day. We wish everybody a merry, merry, happy Christmas, and we hope that you will have a happy New Year. We'll be back to see you again on the 1st, which will be the following Tuesday. We've got two major holidays this year. Last week, I've had a lot of calls, a lot of folks text, email, and various other forms of communication asked me to remind everybody the number. We talked with the mental health folks last week, and we talked about mental illness, some of the issues that come up. There's a toll-free number you can call for more information, and that toll-free number is 1-800-913-6109, 1-800-913-6109, and that's for East Point Mental Health. If there's an issue, a question, or concern, or even if you just want to call them and schedule a program for more information at your civic club, church, or other event, Courtney Boyette is the person you need to talk to. That is Courtney Boyette at 1-800-913-6109. I'm extremely happy to have some folks with us today that I know quite a bit about, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about. But it's Christmas Day, and we're talking to Dr. Penny Ziemer, and we're talking to Tom Millay. Penny, let me tell you about Penny first. Dr. Ziemer is an ordained minister with Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. In 1994, Penny was called to serve at the First Christian Church in Goldsboro. Penny has many accolades. One of the biggest things that appeals to me is that she's the minister at Carl Memorial Disciple of Christ Church, right here between Clinton and Newton Grove. And in all fairness to everyone, I will tell you up front, that's where I attend church, and Penny is my minister. And I want to thank Penny for being here today, and I will refer to her as Penny, as which she would rather be referred to as. But Dr. Ziemer has led numerous prayer groups focusing on spiritual disciplines, has served as keynote speaker for retreats, workshops. She's presented various workshops on living under adversity, understanding and responding to evil, using your spiritual gifts, 7 layers of silence, finding peace in troubled world, forgiving yourself and others. She's published, and her publications are numerous, and we're just so excited to have her. Tom Millay. Tom, we're just excited to have you here, a Master's of Divinity from Duke, graduated from Baylor University with a degree in religion. He's a published author. It's an interesting time to talk about spirituality. We've had troubled waters, needless to say, in this country and world for some time. But over the past few weeks, it seems that we have seen our share of both natural disasters and tragedies, and now we are facing this human horrific tragedy that has unfolded to us over the past few days in Connecticut. And as we've done that, we felt a need to have mental health folks on. We had the program we had last week was on that. We're on Christmas Day here talking about the issue of spirituality and what do we do as a result of these kinds of tragedies. Let me start a discussion by kind of saying that an observation on my part. Our national leaders, when everything else seems to fail and break down, we see our national leaders, and we saw our president, President Obama, standing before the country with a tear in his eye, and he was quoting Psalms 147, verse 3. There's something about this sense of gravitating back to our spiritual self when these kinds of tragedies happen. Help us understand from either one of your senses of background experience the importance of that, especially as we sit here and talk about spirituality and God things on Christmas. Either one. Tom?
Sure. Well, I think that tragedy makes us focus our lives, and that is certainly one of the reasons why this horrific event has brought this forward. And I think it rids us of the distractions that usually occupy our lives and brings us back to the fundamental questions of why we're alive and why there is suffering and whether there is comfort to find in the world or in God or in others. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we find so many people turning to faith or questioning faith during a time like this.
Yeah,
and Penny, let me address the question with you. It's interesting that at this time of the year, at this moment, historically, we look at the birth of Jesus Christ. We look at this sense of spiritual awareness and what's supposed to be a celebratory kind of event, but yet everyone, I mean, and I think a lot of it obviously is because of the major media is continuing to, reverb this over and over. How do we deal with that, and how can our spiritual self, as Tom alluded to then, help us kind of bridge this and understand it better?
Well, it's something we have to be aware of, and as this is airing on Christmas, many of the people who will hear this will understand that that can be a very alienating time. If they've had a tragedy in the past year, it escalates at Christmas. It's a time of alienation. One of the things that I like to turn to is some of Jesus' own experience. One of the things that Jesus talks about in John 9, because this was an age-old problem. They go to Jesus and they want to know, why was this man born blind? In other words, why do bad things happen to innocent people? In the Hebrew canon, that was often dismissed as punishment. In other words, if you were prospering, God was saying, you're doing well, I'll give you good things, and if you're not doing well, I'll punish you. But that's too simplistic an answer. And in the life of Jesus, they come to Jesus. Why do we have bad things and innocent people? And Jesus, what they want to know is, what's the cause of evil and malady and adversity? What Jesus responds is not the origin of it, but the effect of it. And sometimes we can't comprehend the magnitude of the evil that just happened in Connecticut. What Jesus tends to do in his response is not to explore the origin, where did evil come from, but to say, what can we do, given the presence of evil? What's our response? Every why question has two parts, a cause and an effect. And we're human, so we're going to ask those why questions. We have to. If we don't, we'll be apathetic and cold. But Jesus he sort of redirects us back to, it's happened. We won't always comprehend the magnitude of the horrendous violence in the world. We have to keep asking it and trying to correct it. It's true. But now that it's here, what's the effect? And he says, to the end that God be glorified. And even Jesus' response to the violence shown to him. From the cross, he says some interesting things. He looks at his mom and he looks at John and he said, now you be family for each other. In other words, violence is upon him. And you be family, build community back up. To the thief, he says, you're going to be with me. And to the stranger that he never knew, he said, I'm going to build an idealized community with you in paradise. So Jesus was about extending hope for the future. And I think that when we're faced with these horrible things we don't comprehend, we have to somehow follow his lead and say, how can I build community? How can I love and bind up the brokenhearted? Even when I don't know what broke these people, I don't understand the magnitude of what went wrong in this young boy that killed these people. Was it a mental aberration? Was it something in his cultural upbringing? Was it all of those things? But we respond in love. Tom, what do you?
Tom, one of the things that I think is interesting as we look at this whole situation and talk about it's like tragedy is just not a strong enough word to use when we're talking about the horrific violence of 20 children and 6 adults that were just horrifically murdered. But when we look at Scripture, and as a graduate of of 2 major universities in religion and theology, the Bible itself is full of some pretty horrific things as well.
It is, yes, and I think that Miss Penny was hitting on something key, and that's resisting the temptation to explain or to try to find and think you have found coherent reasons for why something like this happens. Some people, you were touching on earlier, some people explain it away as God's punishment, like we saw. That was a part of the tradition of Hebrew scriptures, that calamity visited upon people could be seen as an act of retribution for sin. But I think that's far too simple of an explanation for what is oftentimes a reality that we can't really explain. And oftentimes our simple explanations like that are a defense mechanism for ourselves as we confront tragedy. And we have to sometimes admit that we simply don't understand why this has happened. And we have to be open to that lack of understanding and resist easy explanations of causality for these acts of evil.
Penny, one of the things that interests me is that I think Tom just hit a very key point there, is we're in a society now that we almost expect a microwave response. Just if we were putting something in a microwave and we push a button, in a matter of seconds we get a response. That's kind of what I think we're missing here, is that causality part is what really caused this, and what can we, and the second part is what can we do about it?
Yeah. Well, we're a society that wants to, we're post-technological world. We think we can fix things and we can do it quickly, or we think we want to do it. So automatically we say, how can we fix this? How can we make sure this doesn't happen again? Since we're talking about theology, we often want God to fix it, and we have an image of God. I suspect all of us will go through those questions that everybody's thinking. God, if you have all the power and you have all the love, why didn't you intervene and stop it? You know, that's one of the key questions of what we call theodicy, or that's why does evil exist if God could change it? But sometimes we project a role on God as the fixer.
We're going to take a break. We'll be back in a moment with We Should Know. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. The name of the program is We Should Know. If you happen to be listening to us on WCLN 1170 AM, we encourage you to, turn the radio up, because you're going to want to hear the rest of the show. If you're at home and it's a Sunday, Christmas Day, you've had probably a big meal, it's 2:30 in the afternoon, you happen to be flipping through and you're on channel 16, or hopefully you started from the beginning. If you did, you might want to call a friend, call a neighbor, call your family and tell the kids to play with the toys for a minute. You need to hear this. We're talking about a very interesting subject, something that's touched everybody over the past few weeks. And the subject overall, I think, is tragedy and horrific events that occur. More specifically, what's happened in Connecticut, how it's impacting our lives. Not the first time. It's the kind of thing that we have trouble making sense of. Christmas Day is the day that maybe we can help bring that about. We're talking with Dr. Penny Ziemer. As we said in the beginning, Penny is well known in the religious community, Disciples of Christ minister, well-published individual, keynote speaker in a number of events. Tom Millay, who is a graduate of Duke University with a degree in divinity, also Baylor University, degree in religion, and Tom is also published. I want to thank both of you for taking your time to be here today. It's indeed a subject when we talk about this sense, Tom, we were talking about as we went off air, talking about looking for the why, and the idea that somehow we want to fix this. And, I opened with a comment and observation as the president stood there, believe it or not, believed to be, and I guess rightfully so, one of the most powerful people in the world. And he stands before 300 million or even more people with a tear in his eye and quotes Scripture. It's a unique kind of earth-shattering change from what we have seen before with the political rhetoric and the give and the take and all those kinds of things. All of a sudden, this seems to bring everybody back to a level playing field. And that level playing field is, what do we do? What do we do now? There seems to not be an answer, and we've been looking for that answer for some time. So let's explore that a bit more, about seeking the answer and trying to find it. I won't try to get too much into gun control, because that's a whole other program that probably we'll be talking about after the first of the year. But as we talk about that, that's just one of the things that folks have gone to. They've gone to the mental illness issue. They've gone to all the kinds of other things. But somehow resolving this within ourselves is going to be critical and important. And I think this is just an example. So let's continue that discussion. And I'll turn to you, Tom, for additional comments.
Yes, well, I think confronted with the reality like we've just experienced collectively as a people, I suppose, I think the evil is really undeniable. This reality of evil presented before us. And that is something that we turn to faith to explain, because a radical evil such as that challenges us beyond the normal everyday rationality that we live our lives by. Of course, this community in Connecticut was just living an ordinary day, and then this radical evil breaks in, and I think that's when we turn to this realm of faith and Scripture and these questions of evil and sin and the justice of God. And it's at that moment that we turn to these questions, and I think that's really the reason behind why we see this turn towards Scripture, or a turn towards everyone becoming united together in mourning and tragedy, is because of this reality of evil that we are confronted by and cannot explain. And that is what turns us, like I was talking about before, both to faith and the comfort that faith brings, and also to questioning faith and the challenge that is. And I think in most of us, in many of us, both of those things coexist at the same time, in the same moments. And our spiritual journey, if you want to put it that way, is always a conflicting of those two things. And I think one thing that I certainly turn to in a moment like that is, I think probably the central message of Scripture is God's love is faithful. And there's one key word for that in the Old Testament uses for God's love is chesed, and that means God's covenant love that will not abandon us. And I think that is what people of faith should find comfort in. That, and for Christians, that means that eventually we will experience the resurrection and new creation. And that will be what finally overcomes the evil in the world that we see in an event like this. And on the other hand, while we have that comfort, we're also confronted with this evil and wondering why we are not already at this new creation. Why are we still experiencing these horrific things? And those are questions that I think we must resist easy answers to, because I wouldn't pretend to be able to answer that question.
But you know, Penny, I think that's one of the questions that we're often confronted with, and obviously with your background as a minister and an author and numerous workshops, oftentimes folks will, at least they look at me sometimes and go, how could a God of love, even consider allowing this kind of thing? And those are the kinds of things that's being wrestled with out there within the, I'm sure, our listeners and others, and even ourselves at times. We just kind of step back. How do we answer that question? Or, as Tom just said, is that really something that maybe we not need to maybe step back from a bit and kind of take Job's approach?
Well, you know, and even Job, though, he's called patient, but he really wasn't very patient. He struggled and questioned. I don't think we can step back. To be human and to be empathetic is to get that I call it the cliff, and it's far more profound than a physical cliff. Yeah. It's that cliff that separates us from being God. One of the simple things I like to begin with that oversimplifies it is this: if we comprehended the heart of evil and the relationship between goodness and evil, we would be God. We would have that knowledge. And I also like to use as one of the examples Jesus, the center of our Christian faith. Jesus is God in the flesh, but he became fully human. And in his response to violence from the cross, one of the things that he first uttered is that very human response, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" You know, just like the Old Testament prophets, Jeremiah complains to God, regrets that he was ever born. The prophets questioned God, they wrestled, they struggled with God. But if you're close to somebody, you're intimate with them, you're gonna question them, you're gonna struggle with them. I think the wrong thing is to go silent on God, reject God, and disengage. We want God to be an interventionist. I do too. I mean, there's some days I wish God had me on a string like a puppet and could control all of the world and could control me. But God chose to favor something more than abolishing evil. And that was, He chose to allow free will. Now, that doesn't answer every question. That we have free will and we can make choices. Did those kids that got killed, could they choose not to die? No. So that's too simplistic an answer. Free will doesn't always answer it. But in some ways, here's God. Could God have said, well, I'm not going to put the choice of the tree in there, the choice of good and evil. You just will choose me. But if we have free will, there must be an option other than God. Otherwise, we don't get to choose. So somehow God allows evil in the world for reasons we don't understand. But also God allows His full presence in the world. And we embody that presence. And we become more like God by forming community, we bind up the brokenhearted. We love. You remember 1 Corinthians says, faith, hope, and love, but love is greatest. And I think sometimes when our faith is sort of in question, when we've lost everything we can hope for, we can still love. And God is love. So do we understand why these horrible things happen? No. And I think we oversimplify. We've all said those things that are too easy answers. Oh, well, there's a reason. God had a reason. I don't think God brought that tragedy. I think God, because God is God and has power, does allow things. But you know, God's eternal. God doesn't cause things to happen, but God knows everything from beginning to end, so God has this foreknowledge. Can we perceive and comprehend? No. But I think, you know, with Job, the thing was, the temptation in Job was, if you don't give Job everything he wants, in other words, you don't bless him, will he continue to have a relationship with you? And God says, I believe Job is going to hang on to me, even though he goes through things he can't comprehend. Because our relationship is based on more than just the prosperity and goodness of the life that we want. But it's hard, and we can't give easy answers. One of the things, and I want to turn to, one of the responses, Jesus cries out, why have you forsaken me? And there is some value in letting people lament, and that was one of the genre of the Hebrew canon. Lament in the Psalms, and you mentioned Obama quoting Psalms. Sure. In the lament, the first thing is they just let out they wail their grief. They don't try to comprehend it. They don't try to make sense of it. They just cry out. Why? But there's a movement from the crying out to telling God what we need, remembering what God has done in the past to be faithful, and then saying, I'm going to wait on you, even though I don't comprehend. And we don't just passively, apathetically wait. We become more loving. I mean, there's a lot of love that those families need in Connecticut or in our backyard. Does it explain why it happened? No, but it gives power to our response as a loving, Christ-filled community when we realize that our own Savior cried out. Why? And yet still, one of the last things He said on the cross was, into your hands I commit my spirit. He's not going to give up on God. He's going to stick with God and follow God, even though even Jesus questioned why He was going through that violence.
When we come back from break, I want to talk about that idea of what did we miss in this whole event. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back in a moment. You're watching We Should Know. Stay with us and call a friend. We'll be back in a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, the name of the program is We Should Know. We're on WCLN 1170 AM radio, Star Vision Channel 16. We're reprinted in the Samson Weekly newspaper. The program airs 2:30 to 3:30, Christmas Day today, in fact. Then follows that at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, Channel 16. A replay, if you happen to miss us, you can devo us and play it later. We certainly hope that you're enriched by the day's program. We're talking with Dr. Penny Ziemer. Dr. Ziemer is a ordained minister, published author, led numerous workshops and lay academies. Also, we've got Tom Millay with us. He's a master's graduate in divinity at Duke, published author, Baylor University, degree in religion. Again, thank you guys for taking the time to be here. It's a busy, busy time at Christmas. We were talking about the horrific tragedies that has befallen us. The one most recent in Connecticut, in which 20 children and well, actually, I think it's 7 adults, to include the perpetrator of this horrific event. The question, and this came up, question came up as a result of a discussion with the folks with the mental illness group. This idea of missing something. And I just want to read you a definition from the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They define mental illness as a medical condition that disrupts a person's thinking, feeling, mood, and ability to relate to others and their daily functioning. So a very short definition, but kind of opens the door for something I want to discuss here, and I think is important to discuss. Did we miss something from not only the mental health purview or context, but did we miss something from the religious context as we look at our communities, and Penny, as you look at churches and people, the numerous ways you serve, are we missing something in looking at people and trying to determine the potentiality for these kinds of disasters?
Well, and I'm not saying this is what happened here, but I do know that we need to be a kinder, more patient people. This particular situation, if this young man had some mental challenges, that would be a biological origin. Maybe there's a social origin. We do know that in some eruptions of violence, bullying is a major factor. We know that we can be so insulated and cliquish that we're just interested in forming our own group, and we just are oblivious to people who are depressed around us, who are anxious, who maybe even are troubled in ways that we don't notice because I think we're too much that way. Tom, do you agree? In our society, we stay to ourselves and we look after our small groups, but we're not inclusive often. And when you ignore people and exclude people, if they're struggling anyway, that can sometimes erupt in ways that aren't good. That's just one dimension of the problem. I don't know.
Tom, what do you see happening in the sense of what did we miss? And can you give us maybe some advice to our listeners as to what maybe we need to look at as we're talking to other folks? Or, if you are a Christian, a disciple by means, we're supposed to be discipling other people as Christians. What do you think we may need to do there? How do we adjust that knob?
Well, I think Ms. Penny was right on with talking about how the community, to care of the mentally ill, needs to be a more communal practice in our society. And I think we've kind of pushed it off onto professionals often, and it needs to be more of a group effort. And we could talk about friends, but in the context of this conversation, we can talk about the church, and the church is a community to care for those who struggle with mental illness. And I don't think that's often on the table when it comes to the ministry we do as a church. But I think that we shouldn't be ashamed of having members who are mentally ill in our congregation, and we should celebrate them and love them. And I think that is an essential and very important a very important resource for those who have mental illness to go through life in a way that they're cared for and loved and respected. And I think that could make a large difference in these people's lives, in the anger and aggression they might feel at society, etc.
When we look at some of the kinds of things, and as we look at that definition that I read regarding mental illness, that's pretty broad. So the spectrum of what mental illness is fairly inclusive of a broad range of maladies that may or may not exist, and the aberrations that occur as a result of that can be bizarre. I think what is being looked at now is kind of triggers. Is there, we all have seen or been to school or observed or had in their families or whatever the case may be, someone that was just a little bit, here or there, not clicking at the same time other people are. And then we see other people that get drawn into and do some very bizarre activities. Are there things spiritually then that you guys are saying that folks that go to church and lead church need to kind of look at and make folks more inclusive? Is that the kind of the context here?
Well, I think so. And we're not trying to say this will fix all these problems of the deep, the rupture in mental stability, for instance, in this young man. But overall, if we look for the good and we identify gifts in other people and teach our children and teach our families and teach our faith communities, and if we model that by looking for the good and complimenting and helping others identify their gifts, everyone needs to be valued. There may be some people listening to the show today on when it's being aired, well, on the Christmas day when it's going to be aired, and they may be contemplating suicide. They may feel they're worthless, that they have no value. And what I think the faith community, what I would say, what Tom would say, is you do have value. Life is stronger than death. Whatever you've gone through, it's not too hard. There's a reason to keep living. Your life has ultimate power, a powerful meaning. And that's what we have to say that, and we have to live that. Would that have made a difference in this situation? We don't know. Would somebody reaching out to this young man, modeling love, encouraging him, helping him deal with his anger, would that have helped to find other avenues? Perhaps so, we don't know. But what we can learn from it is we need to be more aware. But I want to say something about awareness. We also don't want to go to the other extreme and teach our children to be paranoid. I've heard story after story of young children that are afraid to go to school now, I mean, how do we teach our children to be aware, to be caring, without being wary and paranoid? What we don't want to happen is that people become more suspicious and then more paranoid, because that can beget a new kind of violence. So we want to teach people to be safe, to be aware, but we also want to embrace others. There's a story, a young child, I was doing a children's sermon once on the 23rd Psalm, preparing a table in the midst of your enemies. Well, that's often understood as, God, I'm in the midst of a terrible place. There's violence, there's all kinds of dangers around me. Protect me. And we do need to pray for protection, that God will protect. We need to be more ardent in our prayers of protection for our community. But one child didn't see just that meaning. I asked that child, what does this mean, that someone would prepare a table for you in the midst of your enemies? And the child said, well, if I were in the midst of my enemies and there was a table with a lot of food, maybe I'd invite them to have something to eat. Mm-hmm. So we also need to encourage our children still to be open and loving, not to become so paranoid that they aren't willing to embrace somebody that they don't know. At the same time that we teach our children to be aware, to be safe, not to be so vulnerable. We have to do that. And as a community of faith, we need to pray. Ask God to protect even those who are about to erupt in anger. One of the things in our prayer group we do all the time is ask God to protect those from taking their own life. Christmas is one of the highest suicide rates, JW, you know that. So right now, whoever hears this message, I say, if you're at that place, you don't need to do that. God is telling you now, I love you. Your life has meaning. You need to call the help hotline, get some help. Call us. We'll pray for you if we need to do that, because it's very important that we get that kind of hope.
Tom, as you sat there and we listened to this conversation, what would you say to those folks out there in the listening audience today or the following times that this program is aired that maybe in that situation they do kind of feel some sense of disdain, loss. Maybe they feel dismissed themselves. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say something that Miss Penny mentioned earlier, but bringing in the life of Jesus and pointing towards how Jesus himself experienced these times of ostracization, of being an outcast from the rest of society. I mean, that's how he went to the cross. His disciples abandoned him. And I think that is something that many, many people experience in this life, is being cut off from the rest of humanity. And Jesus, when he went through that, sought God in prayer and knew that God's love would stay with him no matter what suffering he personally went through. And I think that that is the only true comfort that is always there, because sometimes people will fail you. People are imperfect. And no matter how much we try to fix things, they won't always be fixed. And I think that's when we must turn to God at those times and turn to the message of God's faithful love for us through everything.
Well, Tom, I think you're right on point. We're going to take another break and come back. We've got some other issues I want to focus on. We'll be back in a moment. You're watching We Should Know. Stay with us and learn more. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Again, Merry Christmas on Christmas Day. You're watching We Should Know. 2:30 to 3:30 on Tuesday, aired again on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 7 p.m. on Star Vision TV. We're pleased to be with you today. We're talking about spirituality, or as some of the younger community may say, God stuff. And as we're talking about that, I want to kind of open this last segment to talk about the overall consciousness of spirituality. And I want to quote a book I've been reading. It's an interesting book, but the the name of the book is Implosion by Joel Rosenberg. And if you hadn't picked that up, you might want to do that. I'm not marketing this book, but it's the book is about, can America recover from its economic and spiritual challenges in time? In time. And one of the quotes that I think it was like chapter 13 that came to me was, he says, our country has experienced a moral and spiritual breakdown of unprecedented proportions. Do you guys sense that from Penny, from the pulpit, and Tom, from your experiences in speaking and writing and so forth? Do you experience that sense of a spiritual breakdown?
Well, I'm not sure that it is confined to our country alone, in America alone. And I think it's important to take a broader perspective, because Christians belong to no nation. You know, mm-hmm. We are citizens of God's kingdom, mm-hmm. And it's important to think that way, I think. And this is more of a global crisis, I think. And I think a lot of it has to do with living in a culture of consumerism, and living in a culture where we are constantly encouraged to enjoy things and take pleasure in things, and that becomes the focal point of our lives. What are we going to enjoy next? And bombarded by advertisements and all sorts of things like that. That is the society we live in, and what's distinctive about our society compared to the ones previous to us. And I think that does something very destructive to spirituality, because it takes away the idea of discipline. The idea of discipline has been, I think, completely lost in our society. The idea that you would ever deny yourself a pleasure or do something difficult, like spend time in silence alone before God, becomes nonsensical. And I think oftentimes what we think is spirituality is actually just another kind of enjoyment that we put into one little part of our lives, and gives us some pleasure when we are watching Oprah or something like that. It's just one little part of our lives, and when we are bored with that and through with that, we turn to something else. And that is so far from a life of disciplined prayer that we need to come to a realization of that. And I think at the same time that our consumerist society has kind of destroyed traditional spirituality, at the same time that that has happened, that also gives us, as Christians, a very important window and a very important message to contemporary society, to give them a message that you need to take time away from everything else, spend time in prayer, reading Scripture, spend time not focused on what is your next enjoyment going to be, but how is my life going to be formed by God, and seeking God's will, and being together with other people while they're worshiping God. It's things like that that we can say these are the important and deep and meaningful things about human life. And if you have experienced an emptiness that comes from enjoying pleasure after pleasure after pleasure, but not finding anything more meaningful than that, the Christian message has something to say to you. It has something to say about the deeper meaning of human life and how it can be found. So I think that that is both the crisis and a possible way forward through spirituality as we experience it today.
So Penny, is there a sense from your view that we have just kind of immersed ourselves into this sense of sensuality and pleasure, and we've just become somewhat of a distraught population?
Well, it's just, as Tom said, in a consumer-centered society.
I mean, look at Christmas. I mean,
Christmas
folks are sitting listening to this program today. Yeah.
And one of the anxieties and one of the depressions that will come at Christmas is that it's all about presents to people, that often people don't have money to spend, rather than being present with people.
Right.
I think Christmas is about presence with someone rather than presents to, but it can cause anxiety. Sometimes faith, I think, in our modern age, as Tom was saying, has been equated with entertainment. I think we almost live in a voyeuristic society. Look at reality TV. We want to take pleasure in watching somebody else's creativity rather than experiencing our own and creating our own rich spiritual life. We want to be diverted by what somebody else has done. And we want to be, we want to run away from violence and evil, often by turning on the TV and getting away from it. So sometimes we want church to be a diversion away from the emptiness of the world. But as Tom said, really the spiritual life is not an easy life. It's a deep life. It comes from prayer. It comes from living with doubt. And sometimes the deepest faith comes through doubt, not in the absence of doubt. One of the things that my young students often tell me is, when I teach religion class, is they'll say, I don't know if God's real or not. And there's so many religions, how do I know which one's right? And so that sort of confusion. And one of the things I often say is that we've got to quit, as Christians, dissing the other world religions. If we're going to be models of empathy, we have to listen to other people's faith journeys. I say at the end of the day, faith is like a big forest to me, and I respect, the Muslim and the Islamic faith. I respect the Buddha. I respect the other world religions, but at the end of the day, I have to pick a path. And so I pick the one. Why? Well, I grew up in the Christian faith, but if I hadn't, I picked that one to give me spiritual direction, because Christian faith is the only one whose leader still claims to be alive. And I think we're too surrounded by death and violence. And so I want to give hope to people. It's okay to be confused and have questions about your faith, but bring those questions to God and to the faith community and struggle together as the prophets did, and find love and meaning and hope in that struggle, rather than at the first sign of any question just throwing up your hands and say, oh, well, I don't know if God's real and there's so many other religions that I'm just not even going to pick a path. at all. And Tom, being younger, can speak to some of the disillusionments his age community may be having too.
Tom, I want to follow that. It's a perfect segue into the question. Some of the statistics now, surveys are out there for just about everything, but recently some numbers have come out that indicate that there's a decline, and I'm making a judgment here on your age bracket of folks that you're kind of in, that genre of people in their 20s and 30s, that they're declining from being part of any structured religious group, i.e. a church or a denomination of religion, whatever it may be. What do you think is it? I mean, some of the folks interviewed have talked about this sense of not feeling part of, or there's too many rituals involved, and those kinds of things. And of course, I know, Penny, you and I have had this discussion many times before, but just some comments from your perspective on what's going on with that, and what do we do to change that?
Mm. Well, one of the phrases you hear repeated very often is, I'm spiritual but not religious.
Yes.
And I see where that's coming from. I think institutional religion is often experienced as oppressive, or places where hypocrites live, basically. There are any number of church scandals that you could point to back up that standpoint. But I think what the I'm spiritual but not religious standpoint really misses is that if you say that, you are giving up most of your chances in life to learn from others about spirituality. I mean, what the church community is a place where we can listen to others about our own faith journey. They might question us. Why are you doing this? Why do you believe this? Different things like that. If we say, I'm spiritual but not religious, that confines our beliefs to some kind of personal and private sphere that can never be challenged, or basically from which we can never grow. And I think that that is a fundamental weakness of that position. And I think, though there are many problems with organized religion and church, we must acknowledge those problems as Christians, but say we cannot do it any other way. We must learn from others. We must learn from the good and bad things of the Christian faith together. We cannot be confined to only ourselves. We should not trust only ourselves. We must listen to other people.
We're down to our last few seconds, about 15 seconds to wrap up, Penny. Just any comment?
Well, I would just say that to struggle with why bad things happen is to be fully human and willing to ask those hard questions, knowing that there won't be any ultimate answers that we will have. But we also know this: God has given us the capacity to love and be present with. Emmanuel, God with us, is one of our ways to designate God's Spirit. So I say we just learn to love. We'll be known by our love, and that's how we respond to violence.
Tom, last word, and probably word is about it.
Love, like Ms. Penny said.
Thank you very much. Folks, thank you for being with us today. The name of the program is We Should Know. We'll see you again next week on the radio.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of We Should Know with host J.W. Simmons. If you have a question or comment regarding this or any episode, please send your email questions and or comments to jwsimmonsedu@gmail.com. And remember to tune in every Tuesday afternoon beginning at 2:30 for another informative episode of We Should Know.